Listen to the rain falling tonight, that constant, comforting sound that accompanies us as we explore one of the darkest and most forgotten stories of the 20th century. This is the story of the Duplessis orphans, thousands of children in Quebec, Canada, who were falsely declared mentally ill so the government could receive more money from the federal government. It's a story about institutions that betrayed the most vulnerable, about secrets buried for decades, about children who were stolen from their lives and converted into living ghosts in psychiatric hospitals. There is no music in this tale, only my voice and the rain, because some stories are too somber for embellishments. We begin in Quebec in the 1940s, when Maurice Duplessis was the premier of the province. He was a powerful man, charismatic, deeply Catholic, and absolutely ruthless when it came to maintaining his political control. And under his government, something monstrous began to happen in Quebec's orphanages. Something that would destroy the lives of more than 20,000 children. Let the rain carry you deeper into the story as we uncover how the state and the church conspired to commit one of the most systematic crimes against children in modern Canadian history. Quebec in the 1940s was a deeply Catholic society. The church controlled almost every aspect of social life, education, healthcare, and especially the care of orphans. There were dozens of orphanages run by religious orders, the Grey Nuns, the Sisters of Providence, other congregations that supposedly dedicated their lives to caring for the most vulnerable children. Children arrived at these orphanages for various reasons. Some were true orphans whose parents had died. But many were children of single mothers, children born out of wedlock in a society that considered this the worst of sins. These mothers were forced by their families, by priests, by social pressure, to surrender their babies to the orphanages. They were told it was for the good of the child, that the child would have a better life, that it was the right thing to do. It was a lie, but a lie that the entire society perpetuated. The orphanages received funding from the provincial government for the care of these children. But the funding was minimal, barely enough to feed and clothe them basically. Conditions in many of these orphanages were austere, strict discipline, little affection, limited education. But still, they were orphanages. Children lived in dormitories with other children. They attended rudimentary classes. It wasn't a happy life, but it was a life. That changed in 1954 when Canada's federal government announced a new funding program. They offered significantly higher subsidies for psychiatric hospitals than for orphanages. And Maurice Duplessis saw an opportunity. The calculation was simple and absolutely ruthless. If orphanages were reclassified as psychiatric hospitals, the Quebec government would receive much more money from the federal government. But you could only classify a place as a psychiatric hospital if the children inside were psychiatric patients. So Maurice Duplessis, working with the Catholic religious orders that ran the orphanages, devised a plan. They would declare the orphans mentally ill. Not all of them, that would be too obvious, but thousands of them. The most problematic children, those who asked questions, those who rebelled against strict discipline, those who simply had bad luck. A doctor would visit the orphanage, spend perhaps 5 minutes looking at a group of children, and sign documents declaring them mentally deficient. There were no real examinations, no psychological evaluations, no attempt at honest diagnosis, just a signature on paper that changed a child's status from orphan to mentally ill. And with that signature, everything changed. The orphanage became a psychiatric hospital. The dormitories became wards. The classrooms disappeared because the mentally ill didn't need education. And the children, perfectly healthy and normal children, were labeled with illnesses they never had. Schizophrenia, mental retardation, psychosis, words that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The rain continues falling as we continue this story. And what comes next is even darker. Imagine being a child of 8 or 10 years old, living in an orphanage. Your life isn't happy, but it's predictable. You have friends, other orphans you play with in the courtyard. You have classes where you learn to read and write. You have routines that give you structure. Then one day a doctor arrives. They make you stand in line with other children. He looks at you for a moment, maybe asks you 1 or 2 questions you don't understand. Then he leaves. And the next day, everything changes. They tell you that you're sick now, that something is wrong with your brain, that you can no longer be with the other children in the regular orphanage. They take you to a different building, one that smells of disinfectant and has bars on the windows. They cut your hair very short. They put you in a gray or white uniform. They give you a number. You're no longer a child with a name. You're a patient. The nuns who were strict but predictable before now treat you with a mixture of fear and disdain. Because they've been told you're dangerous, that you're crazy, that you need to be controlled. Education stops completely. Why teach a mentally deficient child to read? Instead, they put you to work, cleaning floors, washing clothes, working in the kitchen. Hard work, physical work, for hours each day. They tell you it's therapy. That work will help you, but really it's free labor to keep the institution running. And the other children in your ward, some of them really are ill. Adults with severe mental illnesses who should be in appropriate facilities but have been mixed with you because the institution is overcrowded. You see things no child should see. You hear screams in the night. And slowly, gradually, you begin to wonder if maybe there really is something wrong with you after all. The rain continues its steady rhythm as we describe the conditions inside these falsified psychiatric hospitals. Extreme overcrowding was the norm. Wards designed for 20 patients held 50 or 60. Children slept in cramped bunk beds, sometimes 2 children sharing a single bed. Hygiene was terrible. Bathrooms were insufficient for the number of people. Children were often forced to wait in long lines to use the toilet, and accidents were common, resulting in severe punishments. Food was scarce and poor quality. Watery porridge for breakfast, thin soup at lunch, stale bread for dinner. Children were constantly hungry, their bodies thin from chronic malnutrition. Abuse was systematic. The nuns and caretakers, frustrated by the impossible task of managing so many children with so few resources, routinely resorted to violence. Beatings with straps, slaps, shoves, confinement in dark closets or isolation rooms for hours or days. Children learned not to cry, not to complain, to become invisible because calling attention usually meant punishment. But perhaps worst was the medical abuse. These places called themselves psychiatric hospitals, so they performed psychiatric treatments on children who had no mental illnesses. Electroshock therapy without anesthesia. Children of 10, 12 years old being restrained while electricity ran through their brains, convulsing, screaming, sometimes biting their own tongues. Lobotomies in some cases, irreversible brain surgery performed on children based on false diagnoses. Forced medication. Potent drugs designed for adult patients being given to small children, leaving them dazed, zombified, unable to think clearly. And all of this was documented as legitimate medical treatment. What makes the Duplessis orphan story even darker is that some of these children were used for medical experiments. Psychiatric hospitals in Quebec in the 1950s and 1960s participated in research studies, testing new medications, experimenting with different forms of therapy. And orphans, children without families to protect them, without anyone to ask questions, were perfect subjects. Pharmaceutical companies tested experimental drugs on these children. New antipsychotics, sedatives, drugs designed to control behavior. Side effects were clinically documented, but the children's suffering was ignored. Some of these experiments were more sinister. There's evidence that some hospitals participated in studies on sensory deprivation, isolating children in dark rooms for days to see how it affected their mental state. Studies on punishment and reward, using extreme behavioral methods that today would be considered torture. There are even allegations, though difficult to prove decades later, that some children were subjected to disease studies, deliberately infected with conditions to study progression and treatment. Medical records of these experiments have mostly disappeared, convenient for the institutions involved. But survivors remember being taken to special rooms, being injected with unknown substances, being observed by doctors who took notes but never explained what they were doing or why. These children weren't patients being treated. They were specimens being studied. And when the experiments ended, they were returned to their overcrowded wards as if nothing had happened. Behind each of these children was a mother, women who had been forced by society to surrender their babies, often barely hours or days after birth. In Quebec of the 1940s and 1950s, becoming pregnant outside of marriage was considered an unforgivable shame. Families sent their daughters to homes for unwed mothers operated by the church. There, young women gave birth in often terrible conditions, with little medical care, treated as sinners who deserved their pain. Immediately after delivery, before the mother could even hold her baby, the child was taken. The mother was told it was for the baby's good, that the child would be adopted by a good Catholic family, that they would have a life she could never provide. Many of these mothers spent the rest of their lives searching for the children who were taken from them. But the system was designed to make reunification impossible. Records were sealed. Identities were changed. And if a mother had the audacity to show up at an orphanage asking about her child, she was turned away, sometimes with cruelty, reminded of her sin and told she had no right to that child. What these mothers didn't know was that many of their children were never adopted. That instead of finding loving families, they were reclassified as mentally ill and locked in institutions. That the healthy baby they'd surrendered believing would have a better life was being abused, medicated, experimented on, slowly destroyed by the same system that promised to care for them. Some mothers finally discovered the truth decades later. They found out that the child they'd imagined growing up happy in an adoptive family had spent 50 years in a psychiatric hospital. And that knowledge shattered them in ways that could never heal. Where are you listening to this story in the rain tonight? What time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. If you find value in preserving these dark stories so they're not forgotten, subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications. Now let's continue going deeper into this forgotten horror. Not all children remained in the institutions until adulthood. Some were eventually released, usually around age 18 when funding for their care stopped. But by then, the damage was done. These young people were released to the world without education, without job skills, without family to support them. And they carried in their official files the diagnosis of mental illness that had kept them locked up. Try getting a job when your medical history says you're schizophrenic. Try renting an apartment when government records catalog you as mentally deficient. Try building a life when you spent your entire childhood being treated as a psychiatric patient instead of as a child. Many of these survivors ended up homeless. Others developed real mental health problems, not because they were born with them, but because years of institutional abuse had traumatized them profoundly. Some turned to alcohol or drugs to numb the pain of their memories. Others committed suicide, unable to live with what had been done to them. And for decades, they remained silent. Because who would believe them? They were officially crazy. Their medical files said so. If they tried to tell their story, if they said they'd been normal children falsely diagnosed, who would take seriously someone whose government file said they were mentally ill? The system that had victimized them had also taken away their credibility. It was perfect in its cruelty. The 1960s and 1970s passed. Maurice Duplessis had died in 1959, but the system he created continued. Gradually, some of the psychiatric hospitals began to close as deinstitutionalization became policy across North America. But the former orphans, now adults, still carried their false diagnoses, still lived with the trauma, and still no one spoke publicly about what had happened. The Catholic Church certainly wasn't going to admit its role in the systematic abuse of thousands of children. The Quebec government had no interest in acknowledging it had participated in massive fraud and child abuse. The doctors who had signed the false diagnoses were dead or retired, and those still alive weren't going to admit malpractice. So the silence continued year after year, decade after decade. The survivors aged, carrying their secrets, their scars, their medical files that lied about who they'd been. Some didn't even know there had been others like them. They thought they were alone, that their experience had been singular, that maybe there really had been something wrong with them after all. But in the 1980s, something began to change. Some survivors began to find each other. In mental health support groups, in shelters, on the streets where many had ended up. They began to share their stories. And they realized the details were too similar to be coincidence. The same reclassification methods, the same types of abuse, the same false files. Slowly, painfully, they began to understand that what had happened to them wasn't personal failure or individual bad luck. It was something systematic, something planned, something monstrous that had been done to them deliberately. And once they understood that, they began to organize. In 1992, a group of survivors formed the Committee of Duplessis Institutionalized Orphans. They began speaking publicly, telling their stories to journalists, demanding recognition from the Quebec government and the Catholic Church. At first, they were ignored, then ridiculed. These were people with mental health diagnoses in their files, after all. How could anyone take their accusations seriously? But the survivors persisted. They gathered evidence. They found documents showing how orphanages had been reclassified. They located retired doctors who were willing to admit diagnoses had been made without proper examinations. They tracked down financial records showing how Quebec had received millions in additional federal funds after the reclassifications. The media began to pay attention. Investigative journalists started uncovering the full story. And slowly, the Quebec public began to realize something terrible had happened in their province. That thousands of children had been sacrificed in the name of government funding. That the church and state had conspired in one of the most systematic institutional abuses in modern Canadian history. Pressure on the Quebec government grew. The survivors demanded three things. First, that their medical files be corrected, removing the false diagnoses that had haunted them their whole lives. Second, an official apology recognizing the harm done to them. Third, financial compensation for the lives they'd lost, for the education they'd been denied, for the decades of trauma. The government resisted. Admitting what had happened would mean assuming massive legal responsibility. It would mean acknowledging the state had committed crimes against children. And it would mean paying potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation. So instead, they delayed, denied, minimized. In 1997, the Quebec government finally established a commission to investigate the allegations. But from the beginning, it was clear this wasn't a genuine search for truth. The commission had a limited mandate, couldn't force testimony. It had no power to access all relevant records, and its composition was biased toward those who had an interest in minimizing the scandal. The survivors testified, sharing their painful stories before the commissioners. They described the abuses they'd suffered. They showed their false medical files. They provided evidence of the fraudulent reclassifications. And at the end, the commission issued a tepid report. It acknowledged that mistakes had been made. It admitted some children had been misdiagnosed. But it stopped short of admitting conspiracy or deliberate misconduct. It avoided directly blaming the Duplessis government or the Catholic Church. And it recommended minimal compensation and insulting some given the magnitude of the harm. The survivors were devastated. They'd hoped for justice, validation, real recognition of the horror they'd lived through. Instead, they received a half apology and an offer of money that seemed calculated to insult them. Some accepted the compensation, desperate after decades of poverty. Others rejected it, refusing to let the government buy their silence with such a paltry sum. And the fight continued, though the survivors were aging, though their numbers were dwindling as more died without having seen real justice. One of the darkest aspects of the Duplessis orphan story is what happened to those who died in the institutions. Because many children didn't survive. Some died from medical negligence, treatable illnesses that went untreated because no one cared enough about a child labeled as mentally deficient. Others died during experimental medical procedures that went wrong. Some committed suicide, children so desperate they found ways to end their lives even under institutional surveillance. And some simply died of broken hearts, young bodies that shut down because the spirit within had already been destroyed. These children were buried in cemeteries on the institution grounds. But they weren't proper burials. There were no headstones with names, only numbers. Rows of unmarked graves where children's bodies were placed in cheap coffins or simply wrapped in sheets. Their deaths were often not reported to families, because families had relinquished all rights when they surrendered the children. So the mothers who were still searching for their lost children didn't know that the child they were looking for had died decades ago. buried in an unmarked grave. In recent years, some of these cemeteries have been discovered. Researchers using ground-penetrating radar have found hundreds of unmarked graves on the grounds of former psychiatric hospitals in Quebec. The question now is what to do with them. Exhume the bodies for proper identification? Mark the graves with the names of the children buried there? Or leave them as they are? Another silent reminder of a crime Quebec still struggles to fully acknowledge? Some survivors have visited these cemeteries, standing among the rows of unmarked graves, knowing it could have been them. That the only difference between those who survived and those who lie here was luck or fate or simply the whim of the nuns and doctors, who controlled their lives. The Catholic Church of Quebec has never fully admitted its role in the Duplessis orphan scandal. Despite the fact that it was religious orders that ran the orphanages and psychiatric hospitals, despite the fact that it was nuns and priests who administered much of the abuse, the Church has largely remained silent or offered only the most minimal admissions of error. This is consistent with how the Catholic Church has handled child abuse scandals worldwide. Deny, minimize, protect the institution above protecting victims. But the Church's role in Quebec was particularly extensive because in that era, the Church essentially controlled all social services in the province. They weren't just administrators. They were the system. Some individual religious orders have offered limited apologies. They've acknowledged that the care provided didn't meet standards. They've expressed regret for suffering that occurred. But these apologies generally come with qualifiers. Context about how difficult the times were. Reminders that they were doing the best they could with limited resources. Explanations that, while not justifying the abuse, attempt to make it understandable. Survivors find no comfort in these qualified apologies, because the abuse they suffered wasn't the result of difficulties or resource limitations. It was the result of a system deliberately designed to defraud the federal government and exploit vulnerable children. The nuns who administered the electroshocks, the doctors who signed the false diagnoses, the administrators who converted orphanages into psychiatric hospitals to increase funding. They all knew what they were doing, and the Church that employed them knew too. The Pope has never specifically addressed the Duplessis orphan scandal. In his broader apologies for clerical abuse in Canada, this specific chapter of institutional horror is rarely mentioned. It's as if the Church hopes that, with enough time, the story will simply fade, that the survivors will die, that the public will forget. And to some extent, their strategy has worked. Outside of Quebec, few people know this story. The survivors of the Duplessis orphans are now elderly. Those who were locked up as children in the 1950s are now in their 70s, 80s. Their bodies carry the physical marks of decades of abuse. Scars from beatings, brain damage from repeated electroshocks, dental problems from childhood malnutrition, arthritis and other joint problems from years of forced labor when they were too young. But the psychological scars run even deeper. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is common among survivors. Nightmares that haunt them decades later. Panic attacks triggered by smells or sounds that remind them of the institutions. Inability to trust authority or institutions. Many were never able to form healthy relationships. Intimacy was impossible when your childhood taught you that affection always came with abuse, that closeness meant vulnerability, that trusting someone meant being hurt. Some survivors never married, never had children of their own, spent their lives in solitude because it was safer than risking connection. Others have families but struggle with the transgenerational effects of trauma. Their children grew up with parents who had nightmares, who overreacted to normal situations, who sometimes shut down emotionally without warning. And these children, now adults themselves, carry their own secondary trauma. Educational achievement among survivors is low because they were denied education during their formative years. They never learned to read well. They never studied mathematics beyond basics. They never learned to read well. They never studied mathematics beyond basics. They never had the opportunity to develop skills that would have enabled professional careers. So many have lived in poverty their entire lives, working low-wage jobs when they could work, depending on welfare when they couldn't. The system impoverished them as children and then never gave them the means to escape that poverty. And now, in their old age, many face their final years without savings, without adequate pensions, still struggling with the consequences of what was done to them 60 or 70 years ago. The rain continues falling. If you find these stories of forgotten injustice important, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and share. The voices of survivors are fading with time. Let's help ensure they're never completely silenced. One of the most tragic aspects of this story is that not all Duplessis orphans have been identified. The exact number of children affected will never be known with certainty. Estimates range from 20,000 to 30,000, but records are incomplete, deliberately destroyed in some cases. Some children were reclassified from orphans to psychiatric patients but never organized with other survivors. They never knew there was a movement for justice. They spent their lives thinking they were alone in their experience. They died without knowing there had been thousands of others like them. Other survivors are out there but can't speak for themselves. Those who really did develop mental illnesses as a result of trauma, who are now in care homes or institutions, unable to articulate what happened to them. And then there are those whose medical records were so completely falsified that they can no longer prove who they originally were. Their identities were erased when they were reclassified. The names they were given in orphanages were replaced by patient numbers. The families who might have claimed them never knew where they were. There are stories of mothers who spent 50 or 60 years searching for a child, only to die without knowing the child had been 100 kilometers away the whole time, locked in an institution under a false diagnosis. Stories of separated siblings who never knew the other existed because records were sealed or destroyed. There are also children who died without their deaths being properly recorded. Bodies buried in unmarked graves that can never be identified because admission records were lost or intentionally destroyed. In some cases, researchers have found evidence that certain psychiatric hospitals deliberately destroyed records in the 1970s and 1980s when the scandal began emerging. Convenient fires in archive warehouses, floods that destroyed crucial documents, records that simply disappeared without explanation. This destruction of evidence means we'll never have a complete count of how many children were affected, how many died in institutions, how many were subjected to medical experiments. The numbers we have are estimates based on surviving records and survivor testimony. The true magnitude of the horror may be even greater than we know. The Duplessis orphans scandal forced Quebec to confront uncomfortable aspects of its history. For decades, the province had maintained a narrative of itself as a distinct society within Canada, preserving French culture and Catholic values against English-speaking assimilation. But this story revealed the dark side of that system. It showed how the Catholic Church's control over social institutions had enabled massive abuse without oversight. It demonstrated how a corrupt provincial government had prioritized financial gains over child welfare. It exposed the hypocrisy of a society that proclaimed itself deeply religious and family-oriented while systematically destroying thousands of children's lives. The story contributed to Quebec's ongoing secularization. The quiet revolution of the 1960s had already begun the process of reducing the Church's influence. But the Duplessis orphan scandal provided a concrete, visceral reason for Quebecers to reject Catholic institutional power. How could a church that had done this be trusted? It also fed skepticism about governmental institutions. If the state could conspire to falsely declare thousands of children ill for financial gain, what other institutional lies might be hiding? This healthy skepticism has shaped Quebec's political culture to this day. But there was also denial and minimization. Many Quebecers, especially older ones who had lived through the Duplessis era, didn't want to believe such systematic horror had occurred. They insisted survivors were exaggerating or distorting what had happened. They argued conditions couldn't have been as bad as described. This denialism deeply hurt survivors, who had to fight not only against the institutions that had abused them, but also against a society that didn't want to acknowledge that abuse. Quebec wasn't the only place where institutional child abuse occurred at this scale. Ireland had the Magdalene laundries, where unmarried pregnant women and their children were imprisoned and forced to work. Australia had the stolen generations, Aboriginal children taken from their families and placed in institutions. Canada had the Indian residential school system, where First Nations children were separated from their families and cultures. The United States had institutional eugenics and forced sterilization of people deemed mentally deficient. What all these cases have in common is the role of religious institutions, the power of the state to classify and control vulnerable populations, and decades of denial and cover-up before any acknowledgement emerged. But the du Plessis orphans case has unique aspects. The element of financial fraud was particularly blatant, children deliberately misdiagnosed to increase government funding. The number of children affected was staggering for a relatively small time period and geographic area. And the use of psychiatric diagnoses as a tool of oppression created particularly insidious harm because it robbed victims of their credibility along with their childhood. These children couldn't simply tell their story and be believed because their official files labeled them as mentally incompetent. It was gaslighting at an institutional level, the state telling a child they were crazy and then using that false diagnosis to discredit any future accusations the child might make. International recognition of the du Plessis orphans case has been limited. Outside Canada, the story is little known. It hasn't received the same level of global attention as some other institutional abuse scandals. This is partly because Quebec is a French-speaking society within an English-speaking country, creating linguistic and cultural barriers to international awareness. And it's partly because the institutions involved, the Quebec government and Catholic Church, have successfully worked to keep the story contained. Despite decades of activism by survivors, real justice remains elusive. No one has been criminally prosecuted for the systematic abuse of the du Plessis orphans. The doctors who signed false diagnoses never faced malpractice charges. The nuns and administrators who abused children were never held individually accountable. The government officials who designed the fraudulent funding scheme never saw the inside of a courtroom. The main reason is time. By the time survivors achieved public visibility and attention in the 1990s, decades had passed since the worst abuses. Many perpetrators had died. Statutes of limitations had expired on most possible criminal charges. And proving individual abuse cases from 40 or 50 years ago was nearly impossible. The financial compensation eventually offered was insultingly inadequate. In 2001, the Quebec government agreed to pay 10,000 Canadian dollars to each verified survivor. $10,000 for a stolen childhood, for decades of trauma, for an entire lifetime impacted by false diagnoses and institutional abuse. Many survivors rejected the payment as an insult. Others took it because they were desperate, living in poverty after lives of limited opportunities resulting from the abuse they suffered. But taking the money required signing an agreement releasing the government from further liability. It was another way of silencing them. The Catholic Church has never paid any direct compensation to survivors. Despite the fact that religious orders operated the institutions where abuse occurred, the Church has avoided financial responsibility. They've argued they were just contractors providing services to the government, that they followed government policies, that they shouldn't be held liable. It's an argument that conveniently ignores the fact that nuns and priests were the ones who actually administered the physical and emotional abuse day after day. Some survivors have filed individual lawsuits seeking greater compensation. A few have won settlements or judgments, but most have been defeated by the passage of time, by the difficulty of proving specific cases, by the disparity in resources between elderly, impoverished victims versus wealthy institutions. One of the ongoing points of contention is access to records. Many survivors have spent decades trying to obtain their own medical files from the institutions where they were held. These records could provide evidence of the false diagnoses, of the treatments they were subjected to, of the reality of their experiences. But accessing these records has been extraordinarily difficult. Some have been destroyed, as mentioned earlier. Others are sealed under medical privacy laws. Ironically, the same laws designed to protect patient privacy are being used to deny survivors access to information about their own treatment. Institutions argue they must protect medical confidentiality. But survivors point out these are their own records, information about their own treatment, and they should have a right to see it. Some who have obtained their files have found they've been heavily redacted. Names of doctors blacked out. Descriptions of treatments removed. notations that might be incriminating crossed out. What they receive is so incomplete as to be almost useless. The Catholic Church has been particularly resistant to opening its archives. The religious orders that operated the institutions maintain extensive historical records, but they refuse to make them accessible to researchers or survivors, citing privacy and confidentiality. There are suspicions that these archives contain evidence that would be deeply damaging to the Church's reputation. Correspondence between Church officials discussing the reclassification scheme. Internal reports about abuses that were known but not addressed. Financial records that would show exactly how much money flowed from the reclassifications. Without access to these archives, it becomes impossible to fully document the scope of the conspiracy. Historians can't write the complete history, survivors can't fully prove their cases, and the responsible institutions can continue denying, minimizing, and avoiding complete accountability. The du Plessis orphans are aging. Each year, more die, taking their first-hand testimony with them. Within a decade or two, there will be no living survivors left. The question is what kind of memory of this horror will survive after they're gone. There are some monuments and markers. A plaque in Montreal commemorating the du Plessis orphans. Mentions in Quebec history museums. Some books and documentaries that tell the story. But it's notable how little has been done to ensure the story isn't forgotten. There's no national museum dedicated to this history. No official day of remembrance. It's not consistently taught in Quebec schools. This is deliberate. There are powerful forces that would prefer this story to disappear. The Quebec government doesn't want constant reminders of a shameful chapter in provincial history. The Catholic Church certainly doesn't want its role widely remembered. Some older people in Quebec who lived through the du Plessis era don't want to confront what their society allowed to happen. But survivors and their allies are fighting to preserve memory. They've established oral archives, recording testimonies while survivors can still speak. They've worked with academics to document the history. They've pushed for inclusion in school curricula, because they understand that a society that forgets its crimes is doomed to repeat them. Children today need to know that trusted institutions, the state, the church, even the medical profession, can become instruments of abuse when they operate without oversight or accountability. They need to understand that vulnerable populations, orphans, people with mental illnesses, anyone society marginalizes, need special protections precisely because they're vulnerable to exploitation. The rain that has fallen steadily throughout this narrative now begins to ease. But the questions remain. How do we honor the victims? How do we hold institutions accountable? How do we prevent such horrors from happening again? The du Plessis orphans didn't receive justice in their lifetimes. But perhaps their legacy can be a more vigilant, more compassionate society that never again allows children to be sacrificed on the altars of institutional power and financial greed. If this story has moved you, if you believe such stories must be told and remembered, subscribe to this channel. Give this video a like, share it, and most importantly, when you see vulnerability and injustice in your own community, speak up. Because silence is what allowed the du Plessis orphans' horror to continue for decades. And silence is what powerful institutions always hope for when they commit crimes against the vulnerable. Don't give them that silence. Thank you for listening in the rain tonight. May the victims be remembered, and may their stories never be forgotten. Among the survivors who still live are some who have made it their mission to tell the story again and again until they can no longer speak. These are the memory keepers, those who have refused to be silenced by shame or fear or weariness. Bruno Roy was one of them. A writer and activist, he spent decades documenting his own experience and those of other du Plessis orphans. His work helped expose the scandal when others would have preferred to keep it buried. He died in 2018, but his writings remain as testimony. Silvio Day was another. Declared mentally deficient at age 6, he spent 15 years in institutions. After his release, he became one of the key organizers of the survivors movement. He fought tirelessly for recognition and compensation until his death. Alice Quinton, whose story became one of the most publicly known. She was sent to an institution at age 7 with a completely false diagnosis. She suffered years of abuse before finally being released. She dedicated her later life to ensuring others knew what had happened. These individuals faced immense pain in constantly reliving their traumas through public testimony, interviews, and legal proceedings. Each time they told their stories, they had to remember the worst moments of their lives. But they did it because they understood their pain had purpose, that their testimony might prevent other children from suffering similarly, that their refusal to stay silent was itself an act of resistance against the institutions that had tried to erase them. Now that many of these primary spokespeople have died, the responsibility falls to others, to academics who study this period of history, to journalists who continue investigating, to filmmakers who make documentaries, to educators who teach about this history to new generations, and to those of us who listen to these stories in the rainy night, who take the time to learn, to remember, to ensure the voices of the forgotten don't fade completely into silence. What's truly disturbing about the du Plessis orphan story is how many of the factors that allowed it to happen still exist today. Institutions with power over vulnerable populations still operate with insufficient oversight. Children in foster care, people with developmental disabilities, psychiatric patients, still depend on systems that can fail them catastrophically. The financial incentives that led the Quebec government to reclassify children still exist in different forms. Hospitals and other institutions still receive funding based on diagnoses and classifications, creating incentives to overdiagnose or misclassify. The power of the medical profession to label and categorize people remains largely unchecked. A psychiatric diagnosis can still follow someone for life, affecting their employment, housing, child custody, and legal rights. And while we've seen improvements in protections for children, scandals continue to emerge. Residential schools for Indigenous children in Canada where systematic abuse and deaths occurred. Youth detention facilities where children are mistreated. Foster care systems where children disappear or are abused. Each time these scandals emerge, there's shock and outrage, promises of reform, investigations and commissions, and then gradually public attention moves elsewhere. Superficial changes are made, but the fundamental power structures remain. And eventually another scandal emerges. The pattern repeats because we haven't fully addressed the core problem. That when we give institutions power over the vulnerable without robust accountability, without real transparency, without the voices of those impacted being central to oversight, abuse becomes almost inevitable. The du Plessis orphans teach that we need more than good intentions. We need systems built with the assumption that power will be abused unless actively prevented. We need radical transparency in how institutions serving vulnerable populations operate. We need to believe victims when they speak about abuse rather than automatically deferring to institutions. And we need to be willing to hold powerful institutions accountable even when it's uncomfortable or expensive to do so. Until we learn those lessons, stories like the du Plessis orphans will continue to repeat with different names and places but the same fundamental horror. For the remaining survivors of the du Plessis orphans, there will never be true closure. The Quebec government will never fully admit the magnitude of what was done. The Catholic Church will never fully hold itself accountable. Individual perpetrators will never be brought to justice. The lost years can never be recovered. The stolen childhoods can never be returned. The lives they might have lived if they'd been given education and opportunities instead of abuse and neglect remain forever in the realm of what might have been. Some survivors have found personal peace through therapy, community with other survivors, or spiritual faith. They've built meaningful lives despite everything that was done to them. This is a testament to their resilience, not an excuse for the institutions that victimized them. Others remain deeply scarred, unable to fully escape the shadows of their institutional past. They struggle with mental health, addiction, social isolation. These are the ones statistics often miss but whose lives are equally part of the cost of this horror. And then there are those who didn't survive long enough to see even the limited recognition that finally came. Those who died in the institutions or on the streets after being released. Those who committed suicide, unable to live with their memories. Those who succumbed to illnesses related to years of neglect and abuse. For them, there was never any justice at all. Only graves, some marked, many not. The rain has stopped falling now. In the silence that remains, we hold space to remember. To remember the children they were. To remember the lives they should have had. To remember the systematic betrayal by institutions that should have protected the most vulnerable. And in that remembering, we make a commitment that we will tell these stories, that we will not allow them to be forgotten, that we will remain vigilant against the forces that would allow such horrors to repeat. The Duplessis orphans deserved better from their society. They deserved safe childhoods, education, opportunities, love. They never received those things, but we can give them this memory, recognition, and the commitment to fight so that no other children are sacrificed on the altars of institutional power and greed. Thank you for listening to this difficult story in the quiet night. If it has moved you, please share it. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of forgotten crimes and historical injustices. And remember, silence protects perpetrators. Only by speaking, remembering, and demanding accountability can we honor those who suffered and work toward a future where such horrors are truly impossible. Good night.